A Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire, Book 1, written by George R.R. Martin, produced by Tokibook.com, and read by Melissa Storn. Chapter 11. Daenerys. Daenerys Targaryen wed Khal Drogo with fear and barbaric splendor, in a field beyond the walls of Pentos, for the Dothraki believed that all things of importance in a man's life must be done beneath the open sky. Drogo had called his khalasar to attend him, and they had come, 40,000 Dothraki warriors and uncounted numbers of women, children, and slaves. Outside the city walls they camped with their vast herds, raising palaces of woven grass, eating everything in sight, and making the good folk of Pentos more anxious with every passing day. "My fellow magisters have doubled the size of the city guard," Illyrio told them over platters of honey duck and orange snap peppers one night at the manse that had been Drogo's. The Khal had joined his khalasar, his estate given over to Daenerys and her brother until the wedding. "Best we get Princess Daenerys wedded quickly before they hand half the wealth of Pentos away to Sellsworth and Braavos," Ser Jorah Mormont jested. The exile had offered her brother his sword the night Dany had been sold to Khal Drogo. Viserys had accepted eagerly. Mormont had been their constant companion ever since. Magister Illyrio laughed lightly through his forked beard, but Viserys did not so much as smile. "He can have her tomorrow if he likes," her brother said. He glanced over at Dany, and she lowered her eyes. "So long as he pays the price." Illyrio waved a languid hand in the air, rings glittering on his fat fingers. "I've told you, all is settled. Trust me. The Khal has promised you a crown, and you shall have it." "Yes, but when?" "When the Khal chooses," Illyrio said. "He will have the girl first, and after they are wed he must make his procession across the plains and present her to the Dosh Khaleen at Vast Dothrak. After that, perhaps, if the omens favor war." Viserys seethed with impatience. "I piss on Dothraki omens. The usurper sits on my father's throne. How long must I wait?" Illyrio gave a massive shrug. "You have waited most of your life, great king. What is another few months, another few years?" Ser Jorah, who had travelled as far east as Vast Dothrak, nodded in agreement. "I counsel you to be patient, your grace. The Dothraki are true to their word, but they do things in their own way. A lesser man may beg a favor from the Khal, but must never presume to berate him." Viserys bristled. "Guard your tongue, Mormont, or I'll have it out. I'm no lesser man. I'm the rightful lord of the 7 kingdoms. The dragon does not beg." Ser Jorah lowered his eyes respectfully. Illyrio smiled enigmatically and tore a wing from the duck. Honey and grease ran over his fingers and dripped down into his beard as he nibbled at the tender meat. "There are no more dragons," Dany thought, staring at her brother, though she did not dare say it aloud. Yet that night she dreamt of one. Viserys was hitting her, hurting her. She was naked, clumsy with fear. She ran from him, but her body seemed thick and ungainly. He struck her again. She stumbled and fell. "You woke the dragon!" he screamed as he kicked her. "You woke the dragon! You woke the dragon!" Her thighs were slick with blood. She closed her eyes and whimpered. As if in answer, there was a hideous ripping sound and the crackling of some great fire. When she looked again, Viserys was gone. Great columns of flame rose all around, and in the midst of them was the dragon. It turned its great head slowly. When its molten eyes found hers, she woke, shaking and covered with a fine sheen of sweat. She had never been so afraid, until the day of her wedding came at last. The ceremony began at dawn and continued until dusk, an endless day of drinking and feasting and fighting. A mighty earthen ramp had been raised amid the grass palaces, and there Dany was seated beside Khal Drogo, above the seething sea of Dothraki. She had never seen so many people in one place, nor people so strange and frightening. The horse lords might put on rich fabrics and sweet perfumes when they visited the free cities, but out under the open sky they kept the old ways. Men and women alike wore painted leather vests over bare chests and horsehair leggings singed by brass medallion belts, and the warriors greased their long braids with fat from the rendering pits. They gorged themselves on horseflesh roasted with honey and peppers, drank themselves blind on fermented mare's milk and Illyrio's fine wines, and spat jests at each other across their fires, their voices harsh and alien in Dany's ears. Viserys was seated just below her, splendid in a new black wool tunic with a scarlet dragon on the chest. Illyrio and Ser Jorah sat beside him. Theirs was a place of high honor, just below the Khals' own blood riders, but Dany could see the anger in her brother's lilac eyes. He did not like sitting beneath her, and he fumed when the slaves offered each dish first to the Khal and his bride, and served him from the portions they refused. He could do nothing but nurse his resentment, so nurse it he did, his mood growing blacker by the hour at each insult to his person. Dany had never felt so alone as she did seated in the midst of that vast horde. Her brother had told her to smile, and so she smiled until her face ached and the tears came unbidden to her eyes. She did her best to hide them, knowing how angry Viserys would be if he saw her crying, terrified of how Khal Drogo might react. Food was brought to her, steaming joints of meat and thick black sausages, and Dothraki blood pies, and later fruits and sweetgrass stews and delicate pastries from the kitchens of Pentos, but she waved it all away. Her stomach was a royal, and she knew she could keep none of it down. There was no one to talk to. Khal Drogo shouted commands and jests down to his blood riders, and laughed at their replies, but he scarcely glanced at Dany beside him. They had no common language. Dothraki was incomprehensible to her, and the Khal knew only a few words of the bastard Valyrian of the Free Cities, and none at all of the common tongue of the Seven Kingdoms. She would even have welcomed the conversation of Illyrio and her brother, but they were too far below to hear her. So she sat in her wedding silks, nursing a cup of honeyed wine, afraid to eat, talking silently to herself. "I am blood of the dragon," she told herself. "I am Daenerys Stormborn, princess of Dragonstone, of the blood and seed of Aegon the Conqueror." The sun was only a quarter of the way up the sky when she saw her first man die. Drums were beating as some of the women danced for the Khal. Drogo watched without expression, but his eyes followed their movements, and from time to time he would toss down a bronze medallion for the women to fight over. The warriors were watching too. One of them finally stepped into the circle, grabbed the dancer by the arm, pushed her down to the ground, and mounted her right there, as a stallion mounts a mare. Illyrio had told her that might happen. The Dothraki mate like the animals in their herds. There is no privacy in a khalasar, and they do not understand sin or shame as we do. Dany looked away from the coupling, frightened when she realized what was happening, but a second warrior stepped forward, and a third, and soon there was no way to avert her eyes. Then the two men seized the same woman. She heard a shout, saw a shove, and in the blink of an eye the araks were out, long razor-sharp blades, half sword and half scythe. A dance of death began as the warriors circled and slashed, leaping toward each other, whirling the blades around their heads, shrieking insults at each clash. No one made a move to interfere. It ended as quickly as it began. The araks shivered together faster than Dany could follow. One man missed a step, the other swung his blade in a flat arc. Steel bit into flesh just above the Dothraki's waist, and opened him from backbone to belly button, spilling his entrails into the dust. As the loser died, the winner took hold of the nearest woman, not even the one they had been quarreling over, and had her there and then. Slaves carried off the body, and the dancing resumed. Magister Illyrio had warned Dany about this too. "A Dothraki wedding without at least 3 deaths is deemed a dull affair," he had said. Her wedding must have been especially blessed. Before the day was over, 12 men had died. As the hours passed, the terror grew in Dany, until it was all she could do not to scream. She was afraid of the Dothraki, whose ways seemed alien and monstrous, as if they were beasts in human skins, and not true men at all. She was afraid of her brother, of what he might do if she failed him. Most of all, she was afraid of what would happen tonight under the stars, when her brother gave her up to the hulking giant who sat drinking beside her, with a face as still and cruel as a bronze mask. "I am the blood of the dragon," she told herself. When at last the sun was low in the sky, Khal Drogo clapped his hands together, and the drums and the shouting and feasting came to a sudden halt. Drogo stood and pulled Dany to her feet beside him. It was time for her bride gifts. And after the gifts, she knew, after the sun had gone down, it would be time for the first rite and the consummation of her marriage. Dany tried to put the thought aside, but it would not leave her. She hugged herself to try to keep from shaking. Her brother Viserys gifted her with 3 handmaids. Dany knew they had cost him nothing. Illyrio no doubt had provided the girls. Irri and Jiki were copper-skinned Dothraki with black hair and almond-shaped eyes, Doreah a fair-haired, blue-eyed Lysene girl. "These are no common servants, sweet sister," her brother told her as they were brought forward one by one. "Illyrio and I selected them personally for you. Irri will teach you riding, Jiki the Dothraki tongue, and Doreah will instruct you in the womanly arts of love." He smiled thinly. "She's very good. Illyrio and I can both swear to that." Ser Jorah Mormont apologized for his gift. "It is a small thing, my princess, but all a poor exile could afford," he said as he laid a small stack of old books before her. There were histories and songs of the 7 kingdoms, she saw, written in the common tongue. She thanked him with all her heart. Magister Illyrio murmured a command, and 4 burly slaves hurried forward, bearing between them a great cedar chest bound in bronze. When she opened it, she found piles of the finest velvets and damasks the 3 cities could produce, and resting on top, nestled in a soft cloth, 3 huge eggs. Dany gasped. They were the most beautiful things she had ever seen, each different than the others, patterned in such rich colors that at first she thought they were crusted with jewels, and so large it took both of her hands to hold one. She lifted it delicately, expecting that it would be made of some fine porcelain or delicate enamel, or even blown glass, but it was much heavier than that, as if it were all of solid stone. The surface of the shell was covered with tiny scales, and as she turned the egg between her fingers, they shimmered like polished metal in the light of the setting sun. One egg was a deep green, with burnished bronze flecks that came and went depending on how Dany turned it. Another was pale cream streaked with gold. The last was black as a midnight sea, yet alive with scarlet ripples and swirls. "What are they?" she asked, her voice hushed and full of wonder. "Dragon's eggs, from the Shadowlands beyond the Shire," said Magister Illyrio. "The Aeons have turned them to stone, yet still they burn bright with beauty." "I shall treasure them always." Dany had heard tales of such eggs, but she had never seen one nor thought to see one. It was a truly magnificent gift, though she knew that Illyrio could afford to be lavish. He had collected a fortune in horses and slaves for his part in selling her to Khal Drogo. The Khal's Bloodriders offered her the traditional 3 weapons, and splendid weapons they were. Hago gave her a great leather whip with a silver handle, Kaholo a magnificent arak chased in gold, and Koltho a double-curved dragon-bone bow taller than she was. Magister Illyrio and Ser Jorah had taught her the traditional refusals for these offerings. "This is a gift worthy of a great warrior, O blood of my blood, and I am but a woman. Let my lord husband bear these in my stead." And so Khal Drogo too received his bride gifts. Other gifts she was given in plenty by other Dothraki. Slippers and jewels and silver rings for her hair, medallion belts and painted vests and soft furs, sand silks and jars of scent, needles and feathers and tiny bottles of purple glass, and a gown made from the skin of 1,000 mice. "A handsome gift, Khaleesi," Magister Illyrio said of the last, after he had told her what it was. "Most lucky." The gifts mounted up around her in great piles, more gifts than she could possibly imagine, more gifts than she could want or use. And last of all, Khal Drogo brought forth his own bride gift to her. An expectant hush rippled out from the center of the camp as he left her side, growing until it had swallowed the whole Khalasar. When he returned, the dense press of Dothraki gift-givers parted before him, and he led the horse to her. She was a young filly, spirited and splendid. Danny knew just enough about horses to know that this was no ordinary animal. There was something about her that took the breath away. She was grey as the winter sea, with a mane like silver smoke. Hesitantly she reached out and stroked the horse's neck, ran her fingers through the silver of her mane. Khal Drogo said something in Dothraki, and Magister Illyrio translated. "Silver for the silver of your hair," the Khal says. "She's beautiful," Danny murmured. "She's the pride of the Khalasar," Illyrio said. "Custom decrees that the Khaleesi must ride a mount worthy of her place by the side of the Khal." Drogo stepped forward and put his hands on her waist. He lifted her up as easily as if she were a child, and set her on the thin Dothraki saddle, so much smaller than the ones she was used to. Danny sat there uncertain for a moment. No one had told her about this part. "What should I do?" she asked Illyrio. It was Ser Jorah Mormont who answered. "Take the reins and ride. You need not go far." Nervously, Danny gathered the reins in her hands and slid her feet into the short stirrups. She was only a fair rider. She had spent far more time traveling by ship and wagon and palanquin than by horseback. Praying that she would not fall off and disgrace herself, she gave the filly the lightest and most timid touch with her knees. And for the first time in hours, she forgot to be afraid. Or perhaps it was for the first time ever. The silver-grey filly moved with a smooth and silken gait, and the crowd parted for her, every eye upon them. Danny found herself moving faster than she had intended, yet somehow it was exciting rather than terrifying. The horse broke into a trot, and she smiled. Dothraki scrambled to clear a path. The slightest pressure with her legs, the lightest touch in the reins, and the filly responded. She sent it into a gallop, and now the Dothraki were hooting and laughing and shouting at her as they jumped out of her way. As she turned to ride back, a fire pit loomed ahead, directly in her path. They were hemmed in on either side, with no room to stop. A daring she had never known filled Daenerys den, and she gave the filly her head. The silver horse leapt the flames as if she had wings. When she pulled up before Magister Illyrio, she said, "Tell Khal Drogo that he has given me the wind." The fat Pantoshi stroked his yellow beard as he repeated her words in Dothraki, and Danny saw her new husband smile for the first time. The last sliver of sun vanished behind the high walls of Pentos to the west just then. Danny had lost all track of time. Khal Drogo commanded his blood riders to bring forth his own horse, a lean red stallion. As the Khal was saddling the horse, Viserys slid close to Danny on her silver, dug his fingers into her leg and said, "Please him, sweet sister, or I swear you will see the dragon wake as it has never woken before." The fear came back to her then, with her brother's words. She felt like a child once more, only 13 and all alone, not ready for what was about to happen to her. They rode out together as the stars came out, leaving the Khalasar and the grass palaces behind. Khal Drogo spoke no word to her, but drove his stallion at a hard trot through the gathering dusk. The tiny silver bells in his long braid rang softly as he rode. "I am the blood of the dragon," she whispered aloud as she followed, trying to keep her courage up. "I am the blood of the dragon. I am the blood of the dragon." The dragon was never afraid. Afterward she could not say how far or how long they had ridden, but it was full dark when they stopped at a grassy place beside a small stream. Drogo swung off his horse and lifted her down from hers. She felt as fragile as glass in his hands, her limbs as weak as water. She stood there helpless and trembling in her wedding silks while he secured the horses, and when he turned to look at her, she began to cry. Khal Drogo stared at her tears, his face strangely empty of expression. "No," he said. He lifted his hand and rubbed away the tears roughly with a calloused thumb. "You speak the common tongue," Danny said in wonder. "No," he said again. Perhaps he had only that word, she thought, but it was one word more than she had known he had, and somehow it made her feel a little better. Drogo touched her hair lightly, sliding the silver blonde strands between his fingers and murmuring softly in Dothraki. Dany did not understand the words, yet there was warmth in the tone, a tenderness she had never expected from this man. He put his finger under her chin and lifted her head, so she was looking up into his eyes. Drogo towered over her as he towered over everyone. Taking her lightly under the arms, he lifted her and seated her on a rounded rock beside the stream. Then he sat on the ground, facing her, legs crossed beneath him, their faces finally at a height. "No," he said. "Is that the only word you know?" she asked him. Drogo did not reply. His long, heavy braid was coiled in the dirt beside him. He pulled it over his right shoulder and began to remove the bells from his hair, one by one. After a moment, Dany leaned forward to help. When they were done, Drogo gestured. She understood. Slowly, carefully, she began to undo his braid. It took a long time. All the while he sat there silently, watching her. When she was done, he shook his head, and his hair spread out behind him like a river of darkness, oiled and gleaming. She had never seen hair so long, so black, so thick. Then it was his turn. He began to undress her. His fingers were deft and strangely tender. He removed her silks one by one, carefully, while Dany sat unmoving, silent, looking at his eyes. When he bared her small breasts, she could not help herself. She averted her eyes and covered herself with her hands. "No," Drogo said. He pulled her hands away from her breasts, gently but firmly, then lifted her face again to make her look at him. "No," he repeated. "No," she echoed back at him. He stood her up then and pulled her close to remove the last of her silks. The night air was chilly on her bare skin. She shivered, and gooseflesh covered her arms and legs. She was afraid of what would come next, but for a while nothing happened. Khal Drogo sat with his legs crossed, looking at her, drinking in her body with his eyes. After a while he began to touch her, lightly at first, then harder. She could sense the fierce strength in his hands, but he never hurt her. He held her hand in his own and brushed her fingers, one by one. He ran a hand gently down her leg. He stroked her face, tracing the curve of her ears, running a finger gently around her mouth. He put both hands in her hair and combed it with his fingers. He turned her around, massaged her shoulders, slid a knuckle down the path of her spine. It seemed as if hours passed before his hands finally went to her breasts. He stroked the soft skin underneath until it tingled. He circled her nipples with his thumbs, pinched them between thumb and forefinger, then began to pull at her, very lightly at first, then more insistently, until her nipples stiffened and began to ache. He stopped then, and drew her down onto his lap. Dany was flushed and breathless, her heart fluttering in her chest. He cupped her face in his huge hands and looked into his eyes. "No?" he said, and she knew it was a question. She took his hand and moved it down to the wetness between her thighs. "Yes," she whispered as she put his finger inside her. Chapter 12. Eddard. The summons came in the hour before the dawn, when the world was still and grey. Alan shook him roughly from his dreams, and Ned stumbled into the pre-dawn chill, groggy from sleep, to find his horse saddled and the king already mounted. Robert wore thick brown gloves and a heavy fur cloak with a hood that covered his ears, and looked for all the world like a bear sitting a horse. "Up, Stark!" he roared. "Up, up! We have matters of state to discuss." "By all means," Ned said. "Come inside, your grace." Alan lifted the flap of the tent. "No, no, no," Robert said. His breath steamed with every word. "The camp is full of ears. Besides, I want to ride out and taste this country of yours." Sir Boros and Sir Meryn waited behind him with a dozen guardsmen, Ned saw. There was nothing to do but rub the sleep from his eyes, dress, and mount up. Robert set the pace, driving his huge black destrier hard as Ned galloped along beside him, trying to keep up. He called out a question as they rode, but the wind blew his words away, and the king did not hear him. After that, Ned rode in silence. They soon left the King's Road and took off across rolling plains dark with mist. By then the guard had fallen back a small distance, safely out of earshot, but still Robert would not slow. Dawn broke as they crested a low ridge, and finally the king pulled up. By then they were miles south of the main party. Robert was flushed and exhilarated as Ned reined up beside him. "Gods!" he swore, laughing. "It feels so good to get out and ride the way a man was meant to ride. I swear, Ned, this creeping along is enough to drive a man mad." He had never been a patient man, Robert Baratheon. "That damnable wheelhouse, the way it creaks and groans, climbing every bump in the road as if it were a mountain. I promise you, if that wretched thing breaks another axle, I'm going to burn it, and Cersei can walk." Ned laughed. "I will gladly light the torch for you." "Good man!" The king clapped him on the shoulder. "I've half a mind to leave them all behind and just keep going." A smile touched Ned's lips. "I do believe you mean it." I do," the king said. "What do you say, Ned? Just you and me, two vagabond knights in the King's Road, our swords at our sides, and the gods know what in front of us, and maybe a farmer's daughter or a tavern wench to warm our beds tonight." "Would that we could," Ned said, "but we have duties now, my liege. To the realm, to our children, I to my lady wife, and you to your queen. We are not the boys we were." "You were never the boy you were," Robert grumbled. "More's the pity. And yet there was that one time. What was her name, that common girl of yours? Becca? No, she was one of mine. Gods love her. Black hair and these sweet big eyes. You could drown in them. Yours was... Alina? No. You told me once. Was it Meryl? You know the one I mean. Your bastard's mother." "Her name was Willa," Ned replied with cool courtesy, "and I would sooner not speak of her." "Willa, yes," the king grinned. "She must have been a rare wench if she could make Lord Eddard Stark forget his honor, even for an hour. You never told me what she looked like." Ned's mouth tightened in anger. "Nor will I. Leave it be, Robert, for the love you say you bear me. I dishonored myself, and I dishonored Catelyn, in the sight of gods and men." "Gods have mercy, you scarcely knew Catelyn." "I had taken her to wife. She was carrying my child." "You're too hard on yourself, Ned. You always were. Damn it, no woman wants Balor the Blessed in her bed." He slapped a hand on his knee. "Well, I'll not press you if you feel so strong about it. Though I swear at times you're so prickly you ought to take the hedgehog as your sigil." The rising sun sent fingers of light through the pale white mists of dawn. A wide plain spread out beneath them, bare and brown, its flatness here and there relieved by long, low hummocks. Ned pointed them out to his king. "The barrow of the first men." Robert frowned. "Have we ridden into a graveyard?" "There are barrows everywhere in the north, your grace," Ned told him. "This land is old." "And cold," Robert grumbled, pulling his cloak more tightly around himself. The guard had reined up well behind them, at the bottom of the ridge. "Well, I did not bring you out here to talk of graves or bicker about your bastard. There was a rider in the night, from Lord Varys and King's Landing. Here." The king pulled a paper from his belt and handed it to Ned. Varys the eunuch was the king's master of whisperers. He served Robert now as he had once served Aerys Targaryen. Ned unrolled the paper with trepidation, thinking of Lysa and her terrible accusation, but the message did not concern Lady Arryn. "What is the source for this information?" "Do you remember Sir Jorah Mormont?" "Would that I might forget him," Ned said bluntly. The Mormonts of Bear Island were an old house, proud and honorable, but their lands were cold and distant and poor. Sir Jorah had tried to swell the family coffers by selling some poachers to a Tyroshi slaver. As the Mormonts were bannermen to the Starks, his crime had dishonored the North. Ned had made the long journey west to Bear Island, only to find when he arrived that Jorah had taken ship beyond the reach of ice and the king's justice. 5 years had passed since then. Sir Jorah is now in Pentos, anxious to earn a royal pardon that would allow him to return from exile, Robert explained. Lord Varys makes good use of him. So the slaver has become a spy, Ned said with distaste. He handed the letter back. I would rather he became a corpse. Varys tells me that spies are more useful than corpses, Robert said. Jorah aside, what do you make of his report? Daenerys Targaryen has wed some Dothraki horse lord. What of it? Shall we send her a wedding gift? The king frowned. A knife, perhaps. A good, sharp one, and a bold man to wield it. Ned did not feign surprise. Robert's hatred of the Targaryens was a madness in him. He remembered the angry words they had exchanged when Tywin Lannister had presented Robert with the corpses of Rhaegar's wife and children as a token of fealty. Ned had named that murder. Robert called it war. When he had protested that the young prince and princess were no more than babes, his new-made king had replied, I see no babes, only dragon spawn. Not even Jon Arryn had been able to calm that storm. Eddard Stark had ridden out that very day in a cold rage to fight the last battles of the war alone in the south. It had taken another death to reconcile them. Lyanna's death, and the grief they had shared over her passing. This time Ned resolved to keep his temper. Your Grace, the girl is scarcely more than a child. You are no Tywin Lannister to slaughter innocents. It was said that Rhaegar's little girl had cried as they dragged her from beneath her bed to face the swords. The boy had been no more than a babe in arms, yet Lord Tywin's soldiers had torn him from his mother's breast and dashed his head against the wall. And how long will this one remain an innocent? Robert's mouth grew hard. This child will soon enough spread her legs and start breeding more dragon spawn to plague me. Nonetheless, Ned said, the murder of children, it would be vile, unspeakable. Unspeakable, the king roared. What Aerys did to your brother Brandon was unspeakable. The way your lord father died was unspeakable. And Rhaegar, how many times do you think he raped your sister? How many hundreds of times? His voice had grown so loud that his horse whinnied nervously beneath him. The king jerked the reins hard, quieting the animal, and pointed an angry finger at Ned. I will kill every Targaryen I can get my hands on, until they are as dead as their dragons, and then I will piss on their graves. Ned knew better than to defy him when the wrath was on him. If the years had not quenched Robert's thirst for revenge, no words of his would help. You can't get your hands on this one, can you? He said quietly. The king's mouth twisted in a bitter grimace. No, gods be cursed. Some pox-ridden Pentoshi cheesemonger had her brother and her walled up on his estate, with pointy-hatted eunuchs all around them, and now he's handed them over to the Dothraki. I should have had them both killed years ago, when it was easy to get at them, but Jon was as bad as you. More fool I listened to him. Jon Arryn was a wise man and a good hand. Robert snorted. The anger was leaving him as suddenly as it had come. This Khal Drogo is said to have 100,000 men in his horde. What would Jon say to that? He would say that even 1,000,000 Dothraki are no threat to the realm, so long as they remain on the other side of the narrow sea, Ned replied calmly. The barbarians have no ships. They hate and fear the open sea. The king shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Perhaps. There are ships to be had in the free cities, though. I tell you, Ned, I do not like this marriage. There are still those in the 7 kingdoms who call me usurper. Do you forget how many houses fought for Targaryen in the war? They bide their time for now, but give them half a chance. They will murder me in my bed, and my sons with me. If the beggar king crosses with the Dothraki horde at his back, the traitors will join him. He will not cross, Ned promised. And if by some mischance he does, We will throw him back into the sea. Once you choose a new warden of the East, the king groaned. For the last time, I will not name the Arryn boy warden. I know the boy's your nephew, but with Targaryens climbing in bed with Dothraki, I would be mad to rest 1/4 of the realm on the shoulders of a sickly child. Ned was ready for that. Yet we still must have a warden of the East. If Robert Arryn will not do, name one of your brothers. Stannis proved himself at the siege of Storm's End, surely. He let the name hang there for a moment. The king frowned and said nothing. He looked uncomfortable. That is, Ned finished quietly, watching. Unless you have already promised the honor to another. For a moment Robert had the grace to look startled. Just as quickly, the look became annoyance. What if I have? It's Jaime Lannister, is it not? Robert kicked his horse back into motion and started down the ridge toward the barrows. Ned kept pace with him. The king rode on, eyes straight ahead. Yes, he said at last, a single word to end the matter. Kingslayer, Ned said. The rumors were true then. He rode on dangerous ground now, he knew. An able and courageous man, no doubt, he said carefully. But his father is Warden of the West, Robert. In time, Sir Jaime will succeed to that honor. No one man should hold both East and West. He left unsaid his real concern, that the appointment would put half the armies of the realm into the hands of Lannisters. I will fight that battle when the enemy appears in the field, the king said stubbornly. At the moment, Lord Tywin looms eternal as Casterly Rock, so I doubt that Jaime will be succeeding any time soon. Don't vex me about this, Ned. The stone has been set. Your Grace, may I speak frankly? I seem unable to stop you, Robert grumbled. They rode through tall brown grasses. Can you trust Jaime Lannister? He's my wife's twin, a sworn brother of the King's Guard, his life and fortune and honor all bound to mine. As they were bound to Aerys Targaryens, Ned pointed out. Why should I mistrust him? He has done everything I've ever asked of him. His sword helped win the throne I sit on. His sword helped taint the throne you sit on, Ned thought, but he did not permit the words to pass his lips. He swore a vow to protect his king's life with his own. Then he opened that king's throat with a sword. 7 hells, someone had to kill Aerys, Robert said, reining his mount to a sudden halt beside an ancient barrow. If Jaime hadn't done it, it would have been left for you or me. We were not sworn brothers of the Kingsguard, Ned said. The time had come for Robert to hear the whole truth. He decided then and there. Do you remember the trident, Your Grace? I won my crown there. How should I forget it? You took a wound from Rhaegar, Ned reminded him. So when the Targaryen host broke and ran, you gave the pursuit into my hands. The remnants of Rhaegar's army fled back to King's Landing. We followed. Aerys was in the Red Keep with several thousand loyalists. I expected to find the gates close to us. Robert gave an impatient shake of his head. Instead, you found that our men had already taken the city. What of it? Not our men, Ned said patiently. Lannister men. The line of Lannister flew over the ramparts, not the crowned stag, and they had taken the city by treachery. The war had raged for close to a year. Lords great and small had flocked to Robert's banners. Others had remained loyal to Targaryen. The mighty Lannisters of Casterly Rock, the Wardens of the West, had remained aloof from the struggle, ignoring calls to arms from both rebels and royalists. Aerys Targaryen must have thought that his gods had answered his prayers when Lord Tywin Lannister appeared before the gates of King's Landing, with an army 12,000 strong, professing loyalty. So the Mad King had ordered his last mad act. He had opened his city to the lions at the gate. Treachery was a coin the Targaryens knew well, Robert said. The anger was building in him again. Lannister paid them back in kind. It was no less than they deserved. I shall not trouble my sleep over it. You were not there, Ned said, bitterness in his voice. Troubled sleep was no stranger to him. He had lived his lies for 14 years, yet they still haunted him at night. There was no honor in that conquest. "The others take your honor," Robert swore. "What did any Targaryen ever know of honor? Go down into your crypt and ask Lyanna about the dragon's honor." "You avenged Lyanna the Trident," Ned said, halting beside the king. "Promise me, Ned," she had whispered. "That did not bring her back." Robert looked away, off into the grey distance. "The gods be damned! It was a hollow victory they gave me. A crown. It was the girl I prayed them for. Your sister. Safe. And mine again as she was meant to be. I ask you, Ned, what good is it to wear a crown? The gods mock the prayers of kings and cowherds alike." "I cannot answer for the gods, your grace. Only for what I found when I rode into the throne room that day," Ned said. "Aerys was dead on the floor, drowned in his own blood. His dragon skulls stared down from the walls. Lannister's men were everywhere. Jaime wore the white cloak of the king's guard over his golden armor. I can see him still. Even his sword was gilded. He was seated on the Iron Throne, high above his knights, wearing a helm fashioned in the shape of a lion's head. How he glittered! "This is well known," the king complained. "I was still mounted. I rode the length of the hall in silence, between the long rows of dragon skulls. It felt as though they were watching me, somehow. I stopped in front of the throne, looking up at him. His golden sword was across his legs, its edge red with the king's blood. My men were filling the room behind me. Lannister's men drew back. I never said a word. I looked at him seated there on the throne, and I waited. At last, Jaime laughed and got up. He took off his helm and he said to me, 'Have no fear, Stark. I was only keeping it warm for our friend Robert. It's not a very comfortable seat, I'm afraid.'" The king threw back his head and roared. His laughter startled a flight of crows from the tall brown grass. They took to the air in a wild beating of wings. "You think I should mistrust Lannister because he sat on my throne for a few moments?" He shook with laughter again. "Jaime was all of 17, Ned. Scarce more than a boy. Boy or man, he had no right to that throne." "Perhaps he was tired," Robert suggested. "Killing kings is weary work. Gods know, there's no place else to rest your ass in that damnable room. And he spoke truly. It is a monstrous, uncomfortable chair. In more ways than one." The king shook his head. "Well, now I know Jaime's dark sin and the matter can be forgotten. I am heartily sick of secrets and squabbles and matters of state, Ned. It's all as tedious as counting coppers. Come, let's ride. You used to know how. I want to feel the wind in my hair again." He kicked his horse back into motion and galloped up over the barrow, raining earth down behind him. For a moment Ned did not follow. He had run out of words, and he was filled with a vast sense of helplessness. Not for the first time, he wondered what he was doing here and why he had come. He was no Jon Arryn, to curb the wildness of his king and teach him wisdom. Robert would do what he pleased, as he always had, and nothing Ned could say or do would change that. He belonged in Winterfell. He belonged with Catelyn in her grief, and with Bran. A man could not always be where he belonged, though. Resigned, Eddard Stark put his boots into his horse and set off after the king. Chapter 13. Tyrion. The North went on forever. Tyrion Lannister knew the maps as well as anyone, but a fortnight on the wild track that passed for the King's Road up here had brought home the lesson that the map was one thing, and the land quite another. They had left Winterfell on the same day as the king, amidst all the commotion of the royal departure, riding out to the sound of men shouting and horses snorting, to the rattle of wagons and the groaning of the queen's huge wheelhouse as a light snow flurried about them. The King's Road was just beyond the sprawl of castle and town. There the banners and the wagons and the columns of knights and free riders turned south, taking the tumult with them, while Tyrion turned north with Benjen Stark and his nephew. It had grown colder after that, and far more quiet. West of the road were Flint Hills, grey and rugged, with tall watchtowers on their stony summits. To the east the land was lower, the ground flattening to a rolling plain that stretched away as far as the eye could see. Stone bridges spanned swift, narrow rivers, while small farms spread in rings around holdfasts walled in wood and stone. The road was well trafficked, and at night for their comfort there were rude inns to be found. 3 days' ride from Winterfell, however, the farmland gave way to dense wood, and the King's Road grew lonely. The Flint Hills rose higher and wilder with each passing mile, until by the 5th day they had turned into mountains, cold blue-grey giants with jagged promontories and snow on their shoulders. When the wind blew from the north, long plumes of ice crystals flew from the high peaks like banners. With the mountains a wall to the west, the road veered north by northeast through the wood, a forest of oak and evergreen and black briar that seemed older and darker than any Tyrion had ever seen. The Wolf's Wood, Benjen Stark called it, and indeed their nights came alive with the howls of distant packs, and some not so distant. Jon Snow's albino dire wolf pricked up his ears at the nightly howling, but never raised his own voice in reply. There was something very unsettling about that animal, Tyrion thought. There were 8 in the party by then, not counting the wolf. Tyrion travelled with 2 of his own men, as befit a Lannister. Benjen Stark had only his bastard nephew and some fresh mounts for the night's watch, but at the edge of the Wolf's Wood they stayed a night behind the wooden walls of a forest holdfast, and there joined up with another of the Black brothers, one Yoren. Yoren was stooped and sinister, his features hidden behind a beard as black as his clothing, but he seemed as tough as an old root and as hard as stone. With him were a pair of ragged peasant boys from the Fingers. Rapers, Yoren said with a cold look at his charges. Tyrion understood. Life on the wall was said to be hard, but no doubt it was preferable to castration. 5 men, 3 boys, a dire wolf, 20 horses, and a cage of ravens given over to Benjen Stark by Master Luwin. No doubt they made a curious fellowship for the King's Road, or any road. Tyrion noticed Jon Snow watching Yoren and his sullen companions, with an odd cast to his face that looked uncomfortably like dismay. Yoren had a twisted shoulder and a sour smell, his hair and beard were matted and greasy and full of lice, his clothing old, patched, and seldom washed. His 2 young recruits smelled even worse, and seemed as stupid as they were cruel. No doubt the boy had made the mistake of thinking that the night's watch was made up for men like his uncle. If so, Yoren and his companions were a rude awakening. Tyrion felt sorry for the boy. He had chosen a hard life. Or perhaps he should say that a hard life had been chosen for him. He had rather less sympathy for the uncle. Benjen Stark seemed to share his brother's distaste for Lannisters, and he had not been pleased when Tyrion had told him of his intentions. "I warn you, Lannister, you'll find no inns at the wall," he had said, looking down on him. "No doubt you'll find some place to put me," Tyrion had replied. "As you might have noticed, I'm small." One did not say no to the Queen's brother, of course, so that had settled the matter, but Stark had not been happy. "You will not like the ride, I promise you that," he'd said curtly, and since the moment they set out, he had done all he could to live up to that promise. By the end of the first week, Tyrion's thighs were raw from hard riding, his legs were cramping badly, and he was chilled to the bone. He did not complain. He was damned if he would give Benjen Stark that satisfaction. He took a small revenge in the matter of his riding fur, a tattered bare skin, old and musty smelling. Stark had offered it to him in an excess of Night's Watch gallantry, no doubt expecting him to graciously decline. Tyrion had accepted with a smile. He had brought his warmest clothing with him when they rode out of Winterfell, and soon discovered that it was nowhere near warm enough. It was cold up here, and growing colder. The nights were well below freezing now, and when the wind blew, it was like a knife cutting right through his warmest woolens. By now, Stark was no doubt regretting his chivalrous impulse. Perhaps he had learned a lesson. The Lannisters never declined, graciously or otherwise. The Lannisters took what was offered. Farms and holdfasts grew scarcer and smaller as they pressed northward, ever deeper into the darkness of the Wolfswood, until finally there were no more roofs to shelter under, and they were thrown back on their own resources. Tyrion was never much use in making a camp or breaking one. Too small, too hobbled, too in the way. So while Stark and Yoren and the other men erected rude shelters, tended the horses and built a fire, it became his custom to take his fur and a wineskin and go off by himself to read. On the 18th night of their journey, the wine was a rare sweet amber from the summer isles that he had brought all the way north from Casterly Rock, and the book a rumination on the history and properties of dragons. With Lord Eddard Stark's permission, Tyrion had borrowed a few rare volumes from the Winterfell library and packed them for the ride north. He found a comfortable spot just beyond the noise of the camp, beside a swift-running stream with waters clear and cold as ice. A grotesquely ancient oak provided shelter from the biting wind. Tyrion curled up in his fur with his back against the trunk, took a sip of the wine, and began to read about the properties of dragonbone. Dragonbone is black because of its high iron content, the book told him. It is strong as steel, yet lighter and far more flexible, and of course utterly impervious to fire. Dragonbone bows are greatly prized by the Dothraki, and small wonder. An archer so armed can outrange any wooden bow. Tyrion had a morbid fascination with dragons. When he had first come to King's Landing for his sister's wedding to Robert Baratheon, he had made it a point to seek out the dragon's skulls that had hung on the walls of Targaryen's throne room. King Robert had replaced them with banners and tapestries, but Tyrion had persisted until he found the skulls in a dank cellar where they had been stored. He had expected to find them impressive, perhaps even frightening. He had not thought to find them beautiful. Yet they were. As black as onyx, polished smooth, so the bones seemed to shimmer in the light of his torch. They liked the fire, he sensed. He thrust the torch into the mouth of one of the larger skulls and made the shadows leap and dance on the wall behind him. The teeth were long, curving knives of black diamond. The flame of the torch was nothing to them. They had bathed in the heat of far greater fires. When he had moved away, Tyrion could have sworn that the beast's empty eye sockets had watched him go. There were 19 skulls. The oldest was more than 3,000 years old, the youngest a mere century and a half. The most recent were also the smallest, a matched pair no bigger than mastiff skulls, and oddly misshapen, all that remained of the last 2 hatchlings born on Dragonstone. They were the last of the Targaryen dragons, perhaps the last dragons anywhere, and they had not lived very long. From there the skulls ranged upward in size to the 3 great monsters of song and story, the dragons that Aegon Targaryen and his sisters had unleashed on the 7 kingdoms of old. The singers had given them the names of gods: Balerion, Meraxes, Vhagar. Tyrion had stood between their gaping jaws, wordless and awed. You could have ridden a horse down Vhagar's gullet, although you would not have ridden it out again. Meraxes was even bigger, and the greatest of them, Balerion, the Black Dread, could have swallowed an Aurochs whole, or even one of the hairy mammoths set to roam the cold wastes beyond the port of Ibben. Tyrion stood in that dank cellar for a long time, staring at Balerion's huge, empty-eyed skull until his torch burned low, trying to grasp the size of the living animal, to imagine how it must have looked when it spread its great black wings and swept across the skies, breathing fire. His own remote ancestor, King Loren of the Rock, had tried to stand against the fire when he joined with King Mern of the Reach to oppose the Targaryen conquest. That was close on 300 years ago, when the 7 kingdoms were kingdoms, and not mere provinces of a greater realm. Between them, the 2 kings had 600 banners flying, 5,000 mounted knights, and 10 times as many free riders and men-at-arms. Aegon Dragonlord had perhaps a fifth that number, the chronicler said, and most of those were conscripts from the ranks of the last king he had slain, their loyalties uncertain. The hosts met on broad plains of the Reach, amidst golden fields of wheat ripe for harvest. When the two kings charged, the Targaryen army shivered and shattered and began to run. For a few moments, the chroniclers wrote, the conquest was at an end. But only for those few moments, before Aegon Targaryen and his sister joined the battle. It was the only time that Vhagar, Meraxes, and Balerion were all unleashed at once. The singers called it the Field of Fire. Near 4,000 men had burned that day, among them King Mern of the Reach. King Loren had escaped and lived long enough to surrender, pledge his fealty to the Targaryens, and begat a son for which Tyrion was duly grateful. "Why do you read so much?" Tyrion looked up at the sound of the voice. Jon Snow was standing a few feet away, regarding him curiously. He closed the book on a finger and said, "Look at me and tell me what you see." The boy looked at him suspiciously. "Is this some kind of trick?" "I see you. Tyrion Lannister." Tyrion sighed. "You are remarkably polite for a bastard, Snow. What you see is a dwarf. You're what, 12? 14, the boy said. 14, and you're taller than I will ever be. My legs are short and twisted, and I walk with difficulty. I require a special saddle to keep from falling off my horse. A saddle of my own design, and you may be interested to know. It was either that or ride a pony. My arms are strong enough, but again too short. I will never make a swordsman. Had I been born a peasant, they might have left me out to die or sold me to some slavers' grotesquerie. Alas, I was born a Lannister of Casterly Rock, and the grotesqueries are all the poorer. Things are expected of me. My father was the hand of the king for 20 years. My brother later killed that very same king, as it turns out. But life is full of those little ironies. My sister married a new king, and my repulsive nephew will be king after him. I must do my part for the honor of my house, wouldn't you agree? Yet how? Well, my legs may be too small for my body, but my head is too large, although I prefer to think it is just large enough for my mind. I have a realistic grasp of my own strengths and weaknesses. My mind is my weapon. My brother has his sword, King Robert has his warhammer, and I have my mind. And a mind needs books as a sword needs a whetstone, if it is to keep its edge. Tyrion tapped the leather cover of the book. That's why I read so much, Jon Snow. The boy absorbed that all in silence. He had the Stark face, if not the name. Long, solemn, guarded, a face that gave nothing away. Whoever his mother had been, she had left little of herself in her son. "What are you reading about?" he asked. "Dragons," Tyrion told him. "What good is that? There are no more dragons," the boy said with the easy certainty of youth. "So they say," Tyrion replied. "Sad, isn't it? When I was your age, used to dream of having a dragon of my own." "You did?" the boy said suspiciously. Perhaps he thought Tyrion was making fun of him. "Oh, yes. Even a stunted, twisted, ugly little boy can look down over the world when he's seated on a dragon's back." Tyrion pushed the bear's skin aside and climbed to his feet. "I used to start fires in the bowels of Casterly Rock and stare at the flames for hours, pretending they were dragon fire. Sometimes I'd imagine my father burning. At other times, my sister." Jon Snow was staring at him, a look equal parts horror and fascination. Tyrion guffawed. "Don't look at me that way, bastard. I know your secret. You've dreamt the same kind of dreams." "No," Jon said, horrified. "I wouldn't." "No? Never?" Tyrion raised an eyebrow. "Well, no doubt the Starks have been terribly good to you. I'm certain Lady Stark treats you as if you were one of her own. And your brother Robb, he's always been kind. And why not? He gets Winterfell and you get the Wall. And your father, he must have good reasons for packing you off to the Night's Watch." "Stop it," Jon Snow said, his face dark with anger. "The Night's Watch is a noble calling." Tyrion laughed. "You're too smart to believe that. The Night's Watch is a midden heap for all the misfits of the realm. I've seen you looking at Yoren and his boys. Those are your new brothers, Jon Snow. How do you like them? Sullen peasants, debtors, poachers, rapists, thieves, and bastards like you all wind up on the wall, watching for Grumskins and Snarks and all the other monsters you wet nurse warned you about. The good part is there are no Grumskins or Snarks, so it's scarcely dangerous work. The bad part is you freeze your balls off, but since you're not allowed to breed anyway, I don't suppose that matters." "Stop it!" the boy screamed. He took a step forward, his hands coiling into fists, close to tears. Suddenly, absurdly, Tyrion felt guilty. He took a step forward, intending to give the boy a reassuring pat on the shoulder or mutter some word of apology. He never saw the wolf, where it was or how it came at him. One moment he was walking towards Snow, and the next he was flat on his back on the hard, rocky ground, the book spinning away from him as he fell, the breath going out of him at the sudden impact, his mouth full of dirt and blood and rotting leaves. As he tried to get up, his back spasmed painfully. He must have wrenched it in the fall. He ground his teeth in frustration, grabbed the root, and pulled himself back to a sitting position. "Help me," he said to the boy, reaching up a hand. And suddenly the wolf was between them. He did not growl. The damn thing never made a sound. He only looked at him with those bright red eyes and showed him his teeth, and that was more than enough. Tyrion zagged back to the ground with a grunt. "Don't help me, then. I'll sit right here until you leave." Jon Snow stroked Ghost's thick white fur, smiling now. "Ask me nicely." Tyrion Lannister felt the anger coiling inside him and crushed it out with a will. It was not the first time in his life he had been humiliated, and it would not be the last. Perhaps he even deserved this. "I should be very grateful for your kind assistance, Jon," he said mildly. "Down, Ghost," the boy said. The dire wolf sat on his haunches. Those red eyes never left Tyrion. Jon came around behind him, slid his hands under his arms, and lifted him easily to his feet. Then he picked up the book and handed it back. "Why did he attack me?" Tyrion asked with a sidelong glance at the dire wolf. He wiped blood and dirt from his mouth with the back of his hand. "Maybe he thought you were a Grumpkin." Tyrion glanced at him sharply. Then he laughed, a raw snort of amusement that came bursting out through his nose entirely without his permission. "Oh gods," he said, choking on his laughter and shaking his head. "I suppose I do rather look like a Grumpkin. What does he do to Snarks?" "You don't want to know." Jon picked up the wine skin and handed it to Tyrion. Tyrion pulled out the stopper, tilted his head, and squeezed a long stream into his mouth. The wine was cool fire as it trickled down his throat and warmed his belly. He held out the skin to Jon Snow. "Want some?" The boy took the skin and tried a cautious swallow. "It's true, isn't it?" he said when he was done. "What you said about the Night's Watch?" Tyrion nodded. Jon Snow set his mouth in a grim line. "If that's what it is, that's what it is." Tyrion grinned at him. "That's good, bastard. Most men would rather deny a hard truth than face it." "Most men," the boy said. "But not you." "No," Tyrion admitted. "Not me. I seldom even dream of dragons anymore. There are no dragons." He scooped up the fallen bear skin. "Come, we had better return to camp before your uncle calls the banners." The walk was short, but the ground was rough underfoot and his legs were cramping badly by the time they got back. Jon Snow offered a hand to help him over a thick tangle of roots, but Tyrion shook him off. He would make his own way, as he had all his life. Still, the camp was a welcome sight. The shelters had been thrown up against the tumble-down wall of a long-abandoned holdfast, a shield against the wind. The horses had been fed and a fire had been laid. Yoren sat on a stone, skinning a squirrel. The savory smell of stew filled Tyrion's nostrils. He dragged himself over to where his man Morrick was tending the stew pot. Wordlessly, Morrick handed him the ladle. Tyrion tasted and handed it back. "More pepper," he said. Benjen Stark emerged from the shelter he shared with his nephew. "There you are! Jon, damn it! Don't go off like that by yourself. I thought the others had gotten you." "It was the Grumpkins," Tyrion told him, laughing. Jon Snow smiled. Stark shot a baffled look at Yoren. The old man grunted, shrugged, and went back to his bloody work. The squirrel gave some body to the stew, and they ate it with black bread and hard cheese that night around their fire. Tyrion shared around his skin of wine until even Yoren grew mellow. One by one of the company drifted off to their shelters and to sleep, all but Jon Snow, who had drawn the night's first watch. Tyrion was the last to retire, as always. As he stepped into the shelter his men had built for him, he paused and looked back at Jon Snow. The boy stood near the fire, his face still and hard, looking deep into the flames. Tyrion Lannister smiled sadly and went to bed. Chapter 14. Catelyn. Ned and the girls were 8 days gone when Master Luwin came to her one night in Bran's sick room, carrying a reading lamp and the books of account. "It is past time that we reviewed the figures, my lady," he said. "You'll want to know how much this royal visit cost us." Catelyn looked at Bran in his sickbed and brushed his hair back off his forehead. It had grown very long, she realized. She would have to cut it soon. "I have no need to look at figures, Master Luwin," she told him, never taking her eyes from Bran. "I know what the visit cost us. Take the books away." "My lady, the king's party had healthy appetites. We must replenish our stores before—" She cut him off. "I said take the books away. The steward will attend to our needs." "We have no steward," Master Luwin reminded her. Like a little grey rat, she thought, he would not let go. "Poole went south to establish Lord Eddard's household at King's Landing." Catelyn nodded absently. "Oh, yes, I remember." Bran looked so pale. She wondered whether they might move his bed under the window so he could get the morning sun. Master Luwin set the lamp in a niche by the door and fiddled with its wick. "There are several appointments that require your immediate attention, my lady. Besides the steward, we need a captain of the guards to fill Jory's place, a new master of horse—" Her eyes snapped around and found him. "A master of horse?" Her voice was a whip. The master was shaken. "Yes, my lady. Harlan rode south with Lord Eddard, so—" "My son lies here broken and dying, Luwin, and you wish to discuss a new master of horse. Do you think I care what happens in the stables? Do you think it matters to me on one whit? I would gladly butcher every horse in Winterfell with my own hands if it would open Bran's eyes. Do you understand that? Do you?" He bowed his head. "Yes, my lady, but the appointments—" "I'll make the appointments," Robb said. Catelyn had not heard him enter, but there he stood in the doorway, looking at her. She had been shouting, she realized with a sudden flush of shame. What was happening to her? She was so tired, and her head hurt all the time. Master Luwin looked from Catelyn to her son. "I have prepared a list of those we might wish to consider for the vacant offices," he said, offering Robb a paper plucked from his sleeve. Her son glanced at the names. He had come from outside, Catelyn saw. His cheeks were red from the cold, his hair shaggy and wind-blown. "Good man," he said. "We'll talk about them tomorrow." He handed back the list of names. "Very good, my lord." The paper vanished into his sleeve. "Leave us now," Robb said. Master Luwin bowed and departed. Robb closed the door behind him and turned to her. He was wearing a sword, she saw. "Mother, what are you doing?" Catelyn had always thought Robb looked like her. Like Bran and Rickon and Sansa, he had the Tully colouring, the auburn hair, the blue eyes. Yet now, for the first time, she saw something of Eddard Stark in his face, something as stern and hard as the North. "What am I doing?" she echoed, puzzled. "How can you ask that? What do you imagine I'm doing? I'm taking care of your brother. I'm taking care of Bran." "Is that what you call it? You haven't left this room since Bran was hurt. You didn't even come to the gate when Father and the girls went south." "I said my farewells to them here, and watched them ride out from that window." She had begged Ned not to go, not now, not after what had happened. Everything had changed now, couldn't he see that? It was no use. He had no choice, he had told her, and then he left, choosing. I can't leave him, even for a moment, not when any moment could be his last. I have to be with him. If... She took her son's limp hand, sliding his fingers through her own. He was so frail and thin, with no strength left in his hand, but she could still feel the warmth of life through his skin. Rob's voice softened. He's not going to die, Mother. Master Luin says the time of greatest danger has passed. And what if Master Luin is wrong? What if Bran needs me and I'm not here? Rickon needs you, Rob said sharply. He's only 3. He doesn't understand what's happening. He thinks everyone has deserted him, so he follows me around all day, clutching my leg and crying. I don't know what to do with him. He paused a moment, chewing on his lower lip the way he'd done when he was little. Mother, I need you too. I'm trying, but I can't. I can't do it all by myself. His voice broke with sudden emotion, and Caitlin remembered that he was only 14. She wanted to get up and go to him, but Bran was still holding her hand, and she could not move. Outside the tower, a wolf began to howl. Caitlin trembled, just for a second. Bran's! Rob opened the window and let the night air into the stuffy tower room. The howling grew louder. It was a cold and lonely sound, full of melancholy and despair. Don't, she told him. Bran needs to stay warm. He needs to hear them sing, Rob said. Somewhere out in Winterfell, a second wolf began to howl in chorus with the first, then a third, closer. Shaggydog and Greywind, Rob said as their voices rose and fell together. You can tell them apart if you listen close. Caitlin was shaking. It was the grief, the cold, the howling of the dire wolves. Night after night, the howling and the cold wind and the grey empty castle, on and on they went, never changing, and her boy lying there broken, the sweetest of her children, the gentlest, Bran who loved to laugh and climb and dreamt of knighthood, all gone now. She would never hear him laugh again. Sobbing, she pulled her hand free of his and covered her ears against those terrible howls. "Make them stop!" she cried. "I can't stand it! Make them stop! Make them stop! Kill them all if you must! Just make them stop!" She didn't remember falling to the floor, but there she was, and Rob was lifting her, holding her in strong arms. "Don't be afraid, Mother. They would never hurt him." He helped her to her narrow bed in the corner of the sick room. "Close your eyes," he said gently. "Rest. Master Luin tells me you've hardly slept since Bran's fall." "I can't," she wept. "Gods forgive me, Rob, I can't. What if he dies while I'm asleep? What if he dies? What if he dies?" The wolves were still howling. She screamed and held her ears again. "Oh, gods, close the window!" "If you swear to me, you'll sleep." Rob went to the window, but as he reached for the shutters, another sound was added to the mournful howling of the dire wolves. "Dogs," he said, listening. "All the dogs are barking. They've never done that before." Caitlin heard his breath catch in his throat. When she looked up, his face was pale in the lamplight. "Fire," he whispered. "Fire," she thought, and then... "Bran! Help me!" she said urgently, sitting up. "Help me with Bran!" Rob did not seem to hear her. "The library tower's on fire," he said. Caitlin could see the flickering reddish light through the open window now. She sagged with relief. Bran was safe. The library was across the bailey. There was no way the fire would reach them here. "Thank the gods," she whispered. Rob looked at her as if she'd gone mad. "Mother, stay here. I'll come back as soon as the fire's out." He ran then. She heard him shout to the guards outside the room, heard them descending together in a wild rush, taking the stairs 2 and 3 at a time. Outside there were shouts of "fire" in the yard, screams, running footsteps, the whinny of frightened horses, and the frantic barking of the castle dogs. The howling was gone, she realized as she listened to the cacophony. The dire wolves had fallen silent. Caitlin said a silent prayer of thanks to the 7 faces of God as she went to the window. Across the bailey, long tongues of flame shot from the windows of the library. She watched the smoke rise into the sky and thought sadly of all the books the Starks had gathered over the centuries. Then she closed the shutters. When she turned away from the window, the man was in the room with her. "You weren't supposed to be here," he muttered sourly. "No one was supposed to be here." He was a small, dirty man in filthy brown clothing, and he stank of horses. Caitlin knew all the men who worked in their stables, and he was none of them. He was gaunt, with limp blonde hair and pale eyes, deep sunk in a bony face, and there was a dagger in his hand. Caitlin looked at the knife, then at Bran. "No," she said. The words stuck in her throat, the merest whisper. He must have heard her. "It's a mercy," he said. "He's dead already." "No," Caitlin said, louder now as she found her voice again. "No, you can't." She spun back toward the window to scream for help, but the man moved faster than she would have believed. One hand clamped down over her mouth and yanked back her head, the other brought the dagger up to her windpipe. The stench of him was overwhelming. She reached up with both hands and grabbed the blade with all her strength, pulling it away from her throat. She heard him cursing into her ear. Her fingers were slippery with blood, but she would not let go of the dagger. The hand over her mouth clenched more tightly, shutting off her air. Caitlin twisted her head to the side and managed to get a piece of his flesh between her teeth. She bit down hard into his palm. The man grunted in pain. She ground her teeth together and tore at him, and all of a sudden he let go. The taste of his blood filled her mouth. She sucked in air and screamed, and he grabbed her hair and pulled her away from him, and she stumbled and went down, and then he was standing over her, breathing hard, shaking. The dagger was still clutched tightly in his right hand, slick with blood. "You weren't supposed to be here," he repeated stupidly. Caitlin saw the shadow slip through the open door behind him. There was a low rumble, less than a snarl, the merest whisper of a threat, but he must have heard something, because he started to turn just as the wolf made its leap. They went down together, half sprawled over Caitlin where she'd fallen. The wolf had him under the jaw. The man's shriek lasted less than a second before the beast wrenched back its head, taking out half his throat. His blood felt like warm rain as it sprayed across her face. The wolf was looking at her. Its jaws were red and wet, and its eyes glowed golden in the dark room. It was Bran's wolf, she realized. Of course it was. "Thank you," Caitlin whispered, her voice faint and tiny. She lifted her hand, trembling. The wolf padded closer, sniffed at her fingers, then licked at the blood with a wet, rough tongue. When it had cleaned all the blood of her hand, it turned away silently and jumped up on Bran's bed and lay down beside him. Caitlin began to laugh hysterically. That was the way they found them when Robb and Master Luwin and Sir Roderick burst in with half the guards in Winterfell. When the laughter finally died in her throat, they wrapped her in warm blankets and led her back to the great keep, to her own chambers. Old Nan undressed her and helped her into a scalding hot bath, and washed the blood off her with a soft cloth. Afterward, Master Luwin arrived to dress her wounds. The cuts in her fingers went deep, almost to the bone, and her scalp was raw and bleeding where he'd pulled out a handful of hair. The master told her the pain was just starting now, and gave her milk of the poppy to help her sleep. Finally, she closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they told her that she had slept 4 days. Caitlin nodded and sat up in bed. It all seemed like a nightmare to her now, everything since Bran's fall, a terrible dream of blood and grief. But she had the pain in her hands to remind her that it was real. She felt weak and light-headed, yet strangely resolute, as if a great weight had lifted from her. "Bring me some bread and honey," she told her servants, "and take word to Master Luwin that my bandages want changing." They looked at her in surprise and ran to do her bidding. Caitlin remembered the way she had been before, and she was ashamed. She had let them all down, her children, her husband, her house. It would not happen again. She would show these northerners how strong a Tully of Riverrun could be. Rob arrived before her food. Roderick Castle came with him, and her husband's ward, Theon Greyjoy, and lastly, Hallis Mollen, a muscular guardsman with a square brown beard. He was the new captain of the guard, Rob said. Her son was dressed in bold leather and ringmail, she saw, and a sword hung at his waist. Who was he? Caitlin asked him. No one knows his name, Hallis Mollen told her. He was no man of Winterfell, milady, but some says they seen him here and about the castle these past few weeks. One of the Kingsmen, then, she said, or one of the Lannisters. He could have waited behind when the others left. Maybe, Hal said. With all these strangers filling up Winterfell of late, there's no way of saying who he belonged to. He'd been hiding in your stables, Greyjoy said. You could smell it on him. And how could he go unnoticed? She said sharply. Hallis Mollen looked abashed. Between the horses Lord Eddard took south and them we sent north to the Night's Watch, the stalls were half empty. It were no great trick to hide from the stable boys. Could be Hoda saw him. The talk is that boy's been acting queer, but simple as he is. Hal shook his head. We found where he'd been sleeping, Rob put in. He had 90 silver stacks in a leather bag buried beneath the straw. It's good to know my son's life was not sold cheaply, Caitlin said bitterly. Hallis Mollen looked at her, confused. Begging your grace, my lady, you saying he was out to kill your boy? Greyjoy was doubtful. That's madness. He came for Bran, Caitlin said. He kept muttering how I wasn't supposed to be here. He set the library fire thinking I would rush to put it out, taking any guards with me. If I hadn't been half mad with grief, it would have worked. Why would anyone want to kill Bran? Rob said. Gods, he's only a little boy, helpless, sleeping. Caitlin gave her firstborn a challenging look. If you are to rule in the north, you must think these things through, Rob. Answer your own question. Why would anyone want to kill a sleeping child? Before he could answer, the servants returned with a plate of food fresh from the kitchen. There was much more than she'd asked for. Hot bread, butter and honey and blackberry preserves, a rasher of bacon and a soft-boiled egg, a wedge of cheese, a pot of mint tea. And with it came Master Luwin. How is my son, master? Caitlin looked at all the food and found she had no appetite. Master Luwin lowered his eyes. Unchanged, my lady. It was the reply she had expected, no more and no less. Her hands throbbed with pain, as if the blade were still in her, cutting deep. She sent the servants away and looked back to Rob. Do you have the answer yet? Someone is afraid Bran might wake up, Rob said. Afraid of what he might say or do. Afraid of something he knows. Caitlin was proud of him. Very good. She turned to the new captain of the guard. We must keep Bran safe. If there was one killer, there could be others. How many guards do you want, my lady? Hal asked. So long as Lord Eddard is away, my son is the master of Winterfell, she told him. Rob stood a little taller. Put 1 man in the sick room, night and day, 1 outside the door, 2 at the bottom of the stairs. No one sees Bran without my warrant or my mother's. As you say, my lord. Do it now, Caitlin suggested. And let his wolf stay in the room with him, Rob added. Yes, Caitlin said, and then again, yes. Hallis Mollen bowed and left the room. Lady Stark, Sir Roderick said when the guardsman had gone, did you change to notice the dagger the killer used? The circumstances did not allow me to examine it closely, but I can vouch for its edge, Caitlin replied with a dry smile. Why do you ask? We found the knife still in the villain's grasp. It seemed to me that it was altogether too fine a weapon for such a man, so I looked at it long and hard. The blade is Valyrian steel, the hilt dragon bone. A weapon like that has no business being in the hands of such as him. Someone gave it to him. Caitlin nodded, thoughtful. Rob, close the door. He looked at her strangely, but did as she told him. "What I'm about to tell you must not leave this room," she told them. "I want your oaths on that. If even part of what I suspect is true, Ned and my girls have ridden into deadly danger, and a word in the wrong ears could mean their lives." "Lord Eddard is a second father to me," said Theon Greyjoy. "I do so swear." "You have my oath," Master Luwin said. "And mine, my lady," echoed Sir Roderick. She looked at her son. "And you, Robb?" He nodded his consent. "My sister Lisa believes the Lannisters murdered her husband, Lord Arryn, the Hand of the King," Catelyn told them. "It comes to me that Jaime Lannister did not join the hunt the day Bran fell. He remained here in the castle." The room was deathly quiet. "I do not think Bran fell from that tower," she said into the stillness. "I think he was thrown." The shock was plain on their faces. "My lady, that is a monstrous suggestion," said Roderick Castle. "Even the Kingslayer would flinch at the murder of an innocent child." "Oh, would he?" Theon Greyjoy asked. "I wonder." "There is no limit to Lannister pride or Lannister ambition," Catelyn said. "The boy had always been sure-handed in the past," Master Luwin said thoughtfully. "He knew every stone in Winterfell." "Gods!" Robb swore, his young face dark with anger. "If this is true, he will pay for it." He drew his sword and waved it in the air. "I'll kill him myself." Sir Roderick bristled at him. "Put that away. The Lannisters are 100 leagues away. Never draw your sword unless you mean to use it. How many times must I tell you, foolish boy?" Abashed, Robb sheathed his sword, suddenly a child again. Catelyn said to Sir Roderick, "I see my son is wearing steel now." The old Master-at-Arms said, "I thought it was time." Robb was looking at her anxiously. "Past time," she said. "Winterfell may have need of all its swords soon, and they had best not be made of wood." Theon Greyjoy put a hand on the hilt of his blade and said, "My lady, if it comes to that, my house owes yours a great debt." Master Luwin pulled at his chain collar where it chafed against his neck. "All we have is conjecture. This is the Queen's beloved brother we mean to accuse. She will not take it kindly. We must have proof, or forever keep silent." "Your proof is in the dagger," Sir Roderick said. "A fine blade like that will not have gone unnoticed." There was only one place to find the truth of it, Catelyn realized. "Someone must go to King's Landing." "I'll go," Robb said. "No," she told him. "Your place is here. There must always be a Stark in Winterfell." She looked at Sir Roderick with his great white whiskers, at Master Luwin in his grey robes, at young Greyjoy, lean and dark and impetuous. Who to send? Who would be believed? Then she knew. Catelyn struggled to push back two blankets, her bandaged fingers as stiff and unyielding as stone. She climbed out of bed. "I must go myself." "My lady," said Master Luwin, "is that wise? Surely the Lannisters would greet your arrival with suspicion." "What about Bran?" Robb asked. The poor boy looked utterly confused now. "You can't mean to leave him." "I've done everything I can for Bran," she said, laying a wounded hand on his arm. "His life is in the hands of the gods and Master Luwin. As you reminded me yourself, Robb, I have other children to think of now." "You will need a strong escort, my lady," Theon said. "I'll send Hal with a squad of guardsmen," Robb said. "No," Catelyn said. "A large party attracts unwelcome attention. I would not have the Lannisters know I'm coming." Sir Roderick protested. "My lady, let me accompany you at least. The King's Road can be perilous for a woman alone." "I will not be taking the King's Road," Catelyn replied. She thought for a moment, then nodded her consent. "Two riders can move as fast as one, and a good deal faster than a long column burdened by wagons and wheelhouses. I will welcome your company, Sir Roderick. We will follow the White Knife down to the sea, and hire a ship at White Harbour. Strong horses and brisk winds should bring us to King's Landing well ahead of Ned and the Lannisters. And then, she thought, we shall see what we shall see." Chapter 15. Sansa. Addit Stark had left before dawn, Septa Mordane informed Sansa as they broke their fast. The king sent for him. Another hunt, I do believe. There are still wild aurochs in these lands, I'm told. I've never seen an aurochs, Sansa said, feeding a piece of bacon to Lady under the table. The dire wolf took it from her hand, as delicate as a queen. Septa Mordane sniffed in disapproval. A noble lady does not feed dogs at her table, she said, breaking off another piece of comb and letting the honey drip down onto her bread. She's not a dog, she's a dire wolf, Sansa pointed out as Lady licked her fingers with a rough tongue. Anyway, Father said we could keep them with us if we want. The Septa was not appeased. You're a good girl, Sansa, but I do vow, when it comes to that creature you're as willful as your sister Arya. She scowled. And where is Arya this morning? She wasn't hungry, Sansa said, knowing full well that her sister had probably stolen down to the kitchen hours ago and wheedled a breakfast out of some cook's boy. Do remind her to dress nicely today. The grey velvet, perhaps. We're all invited to ride with the Queen and Princess Myrcella in the royal wheelhouse, and we must look our best. Sansa already looked her best. She had brushed out her long auburn hair until it shone, and picked her nicest blue silks. She had been looking forward to today for more than a week. It was a great honor to ride with the Queen, and besides, Prince Joffrey might be there, her betrothed. Just thinking it made her feel a strange fluttering inside, even though they were not to marry for years and years. Sansa did not really know Joffrey yet, but she was already in love with him. He was all she ever dreamed her prince should be, tall and handsome and strong, with hair like gold. She treasured every chance to spend time with him, few as they were. The only thing that scared her about today was Arya. Arya had a way of ruining everything. You never knew what she would do. I'll tell her, Sansa said uncertainly, but she'll dress the way she always does. She hoped it wouldn't be too embarrassing. May I be excused? You may. Septa Mordane helped herself to more bread and honey, and Sansa slid from the bench. Lady followed at her heels as she ran from the inn's common room. Outside, she stood for a moment amidst the shouts and curses and the creak of wooden wheels as the men broke down the tents and pavilions and loaded the wagons for another day's march. The inn was a sprawling 3-story structure of pale stone, the biggest that Sansa had ever seen, but even so, it had accommodations for less than a third of the king's party, which had swollen to more than 400, with the addition of her father's household and the free riders who had joined them on the road. She found Arya on the banks of the Trident, trying to hold Nymeria still while she brushed dried mud from her fur. The dire wolf was not enjoying the process. Arya was wearing the same riding leathers she had worn yesterday and the day before. You better put on something pretty, Sansa told her. Septa Mordane said so. We're traveling in the Queen's wheelhouse with Princess Myrcella today. I'm not, Arya said, trying to brush a tangle out of Nymeria's matted grey fur. Mika and I are going to ride upstream and look for rubies at the ford. Rubies, Sansa said, lost. What rubies? Arya gave her a look like she was so stupid. Rhaegar's rubies. This is where King Robert killed him and won the crown. Sansa regarded her scrawny little sister in disbelief. You can't look for rubies. The princess is expecting us. The Queen invited us both. I don't care, Arya said. The wheelhouse doesn't even have windows. You can't see a thing. What could you want to see? Sansa said, annoyed. She had been thrilled by the invitation, and her stupid sister was going to ruin everything, just as she'd feared. It's all just fields and farms and holdfasts. It is not, Arya said stubbornly. If you came with us sometimes, you'd see. I hate riding, Sansa said fervently. All it does is get you soiled and dusty and sore. Arya shrugged. Hold still, she snapped at Nymeria. I'm not hurting you. Then to Sansa she said, when we were crossing the neck, I counted 36 flowers I never saw before, and Mika showed me a lizard lion. Sansa shuddered. There had been 12 days crossing the neck, rumbling down a crooked causeway through an endless black bog, and she had hated every moment of it. The air had been damp and clammy, the causeway so narrow they could not even make proper camp at night. They had to stop right on the king's road. Dense thickets of half-drowned trees pressed close around them, branches dripping with curtains of pale fungus. Huge flowers bloomed in the mud and floated on pools of stagnant water, but if you were stupid enough to leave the causeway to pluck them, there were quicksands waiting to suck you down, and snakes watching from the trees, and lizard lions floating half submerged in the water like black logs with eyes and teeth. None of which stopped Arya, of course. One day she came back grinning her horsey grin, her hair all tangled and her clothes covered in mud, clutching a raggedy bunch of purple and green flowers for father. Sansa kept hoping he would tell Arya to behave herself and act like the high-born lady she was supposed to be. But he never did. He only hugged her and thanked her for the flowers. That just made her worse. Then it turned out the purple flowers were called poison kisses, and Arya got a rash on her arms. Sansa would have thought that might have taught her a lesson, but Arya laughed about it, and the next day she rubbed mud all over her arms like some ignorant bog woman just because her friend Mika told her it would stop the itching. She had bruises on her arms and shoulders too, dark purple welts and faded green and yellow splotches. Sansa had seen them when her sister undressed for sleep. How she had gotten those only the 7 gods knew. Arya was still going on, brushing out Nymeria's tangles and chattering about things she had seen on the trek south. "Last week we found this haunted watchtower, and the day before we chased a herd of wild horses. You should have seen them run when they caught the scent of Nymeria." The wolf wriggled in her grasp, and Arya scolded her. "Stop that! I have to do the other side. You're all muddy." "You're not supposed to leave the column," Sansa reminded her. "Father said so." Arya shrugged. "I didn't go far. Anyway, Nymeria was with me the whole time. I don't always go off either. Sometimes it's fun just to ride along with the wagons and talk to people." Sansa knew all about the sorts of people Arya liked to talk to. Squires and grooms and serving girls, old men and naked children, rough-spoken free-riders of uncertain birth. Arya would make friends with anybody. This Mika was the worst, a butcher's boy, 13 and wild. He slept in a meat wagon and smelled of the slaughtering block. Just the sight of him was enough to make Sansa feel sick, but Arya seemed to prefer his company to hers. Sansa was running out of patience now. "You have to come with me," she told her sister firmly. "You can't refuse the Queen. Septa Mordane will expect you." Arya ignored her. She gave a hard yank with the brush. Nymeria growled and spun away, affronted. "Come back here." "There's going to be lemon cakes and tea," Sansa went on, all adult and reasonable. Lady brushed against her leg. Sansa scratched her ears the way she liked, and Lady sat beside her on her haunches, watching Arya chase Nymeria. "Why would you want to ride a smelly old horse and get all sore and sweaty, when you could recline on feather pillows and eat cakes with the Queen?" "I don't like the Queen," Arya said casually. Sansa sucked in her breath, shocked that even Arya would say such a thing, but her sister prattled on, heedless. "She won't even let me bring Nymeria." She thrust the brush under her belt and stalked her wolf. Nymeria watched her approach warily. "A royal wheelhouse is no place for a wolf," Sansa said. "And Princess Myrcella is afraid of them, you know that." "Myrcella is a little baby." Arya grabbed Nymeria round her neck, but the moment she pulled out the brush again, the direwolf wriggled free and bounded off. Frustrated, Arya threw down the brush. "Bad wolf!" she shouted. Sansa couldn't help but smile a little. The kennel master once told her that an animal takes after its master. She gave Lady a quick little hug. Lady licked her cheek. Sansa giggled. Arya heard and whirled around, glaring. "I don't care what you say. I'm going out riding." Her long horsey face got a stubborn look that meant she was going to do something willful. "Gods be true, Arya, sometimes you act like such a child," Sansa said. "I'll go by myself then. It will be ever so much nicer that way. Lady and I will eat all the lemon cakes and just have the best time without you." She turned to walk off, but Arya shouted after her. "They won't let you bring Lady either." She was gone before Sansa could think of a reply, chasing Nymeria along the river. Alone and humiliated, Sansa took the long way back to the inn where she knew Septa Mordane would be waiting. Lady padded quietly by her side. She was almost in tears. All she wanted was for things to be nice and pretty, the way they were in the songs. Why couldn't Arya be sweet and delicate and kind, like Princess Myrcella? She would have liked a sister like that. Sansa could never understand how two sisters, born only 2 years apart, could be so different. It would have been easier if Arya had been a bastard, like their half-brother Jon. She even looked like Jon, with the long face and brown hair of the Starks, and nothing of their lady mother in her face or her colouring. And Jon's mother had been common, or so people whispered. Once, when she was littler, Sansa had even asked Mother if perhaps there hadn't been some mistake. Perhaps the Grumpkins had stolen her real sister. But Mother had only laughed and said no. Arya was her daughter and Sansa's true-born sister, blood of their blood. Sansa could not think why Mother would want to lie about it, so she supposed it had to be true. As she neared the center of camp, her distress was quickly forgotten. A crowd had gathered around the Queen's wheelhouse. Sansa heard excited voices buzzing like a hive of bees. The doors had been thrown open, she saw, and the Queen stood at the top of the wooden steps, smiling down at someone. She heard her saying, "The council does us great honor, my good lords." "What's happening?" she asked a squire she knew. "The council sent riders from King's Landing to escort us the rest of the way," he told her. "On honor guard for the king." Anxious to see, Sansa let Lady clear a path through the crowd. People moved aside hastily for the dire wolf. When she got closer, she saw 2 knights kneeling before the Queen, in armor so fine and gorgeous that it made her blink. One knight wore an intricate suit of white enamel scales, brilliant as a field of new-fallen snow, with silver chasings and clasps that glittered in the sun. When he removed his helm, Sansa saw that he was an old man with hair as pale as his armor, yet he seemed strong and graceful for all that. From his shoulders hung the pure white cloak of the king's guard. His companion was a man near 20, whose armor was steel plate of a deep forest green. He was the handsomest man Sansa had ever set eyes upon. Tall and powerfully made, with jet black hair that fell to his shoulders and framed a clean-shaven face and laughing green eyes to match his armor. Cradled under one arm was an antlered helm, its magnificent rack shimmering in gold. At first, Sansa did not notice the third stranger. He did not kneel with the others. He stood to one side, beside their horses, a gaunt grim man who watched the proceedings in silence. His face was pockmarked and beardless, with deep-set eyes and hollow cheeks. Though he was not an old man, only a few wisps of hair remained to him, sprouting above his ears, but those he had grown long as women's. His armor was iron-grey chainmail over layers of boiled leather, plain and unadorned, and it spoke of age and hard use. Above his right shoulder the stained leather hilt of the blade strapped to his back was visible, a 2-handed greatsword, too long to be worn at his side. "The king is gone hunting, but I know he will be pleased to see you when he returns," the Queen was saying to the 2 knights who knelt before her, but Sansa could not take her eyes off the third man. He seemed to feel the weight of her gaze. Slowly he turned his head. Lady growled. A terror as overwhelming as anything Sansa Stark had ever felt filled her suddenly. She stepped backward and bumped into someone. Strong hands grasped her by the shoulders, and for a moment Sansa thought it was her father, but when she turned, it was the burnt face of Sandor Clegane looking down at her, his mouth twisted in a terrible mockery of a smile. "You are shaking, girl," he said, his voice rasping. "Do I frighten you so much?" He did, and had since she had first laid eyes on the ruin that fire had made of his face, though it seemed to her now that he was not half so terrifying as the other. Still, Sansa wrenched away from him, and the hound laughed, and Lady moved between them, rumbling a warning. Sansa dropped to her knees to wrap her arms around the wolf. They were all gathered around gaping. She could feel their eyes on her, and here and there she heard muttered comments and titters of laughter. "A wolf," a man said, and someone else said, "7 hells, that's a dire wolf." And the first man said, "What's it doing in camp?" And the hound's rasping voice replied, "The Starks used him for wet nurses." And Sansa realized that the 2 stranger knights were looking down on her and Lady, swords in their hands, and then she was frightened again, and ashamed. Tears filled her eyes. She heard the Queen say, "Joffrey, go to her." And her prince was there. "Leave her alone," Joffrey said. He stood over her, beautiful in blue wool and black leather, his golden curls shining in the sun like a crown. He gave her his hand, drew her to her feet. "What is it, sweet lady? Why are you afraid? No one will hurt you. Put away your swords, all of you. The wolf is her little pet, that's all." He looked at Sander Clegane. "And you, dog, away with you. You're scaring my betrothed." The hound, ever faithful, bowed and slid away quietly through the press. Sansa struggled to steady herself. She felt like such a fool. She was a Stark of Winterfell, a noble lady, and some day she would be a queen. "It was not him, my sweet prince," she tried to explain. "It was the other one." The two stranger knights exchanged a look. "Pain?" chuckled the young man in the green armor. The older man in white spoke to Sansa gently. "Oft-times Sir Ilyn frightens me as well, sweet lady. He has a fearsome aspect." As well he should. The queen had descended from the wheelhouse. The spectators parted to make way for her. "If the wicked do not fear the Ming's justice, you have put the wrong man in the office." Sansa finally found her words. "Then surely you have chosen the right one, your grace," she said, and a gale of laughter erupted all around her. "Well spoken, child," said the old man in white. "As befits the daughter of Eddard Stark. I'm honored to know you, however irregular the manner of our meeting. I'm Sir Barristan Selmy, of the Kingsguard." He bowed. Sansa knew the name, and now the courtesies that Septa Mordane had taught her over the years came back to her. "The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard," she said, "and counsellor to Robert our King and to Aerys Targaryen before him. The honor is mine, good knight. Even in the far north, the singers praise the deeds of Barristan the Bold." The Green Knight laughed again. "Barristan the Old, you mean? Don't flatter him too sweetly, child. He thinks overmuch of himself already." He smiled at her. "Now, wolf girl, if you can put a name to me as well, then I must concede that you are truly our Hand's daughter." Joffrey stiffened beside her. "Have a care how you address my betrothed." "I can answer," Sansa said quickly, to quell her prince's anger. She smiled at the Green Knight. "Your helmet bears golden antlers, my lord. The stag is the sigil of the royal house. King Robert has 2 brothers. By your extreme youth, you can only be Renly Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End and Counsellor to the King, and so I name you." Sir Barristan chuckled. "By his extreme youth, he can only be a prancing jackanapes, and so I name him." There was general laughter, led by Lord Renly himself. The tension of a few moments ago was gone, and Sansa was beginning to feel comfortable. Until Sir Ilyn Payne shouldered 2 men aside and stood before her, unsmiling. He did not say a word. Lady bared her teeth and began to growl, a low rumble full of menace, but this time Sansa silenced the wolf with a gentle hand to the head. "I'm sorry if I offended you, Sir Ilyn," she said. She waited for an answer, but none came. As the headsman looked at her, his pale, colorless eyes seemed to strip the clothes away from her, and then the skin, leaving her soul naked before him. Still silent, he turned and walked away. Sansa did not understand. She looked at her prince. "Did I say something wrong, your grace? Why will he not speak to me?" "Sir Ilyn has not been feeling talkative these past 14 years, Lord Renly commented with a sly smile. Joffrey gave his uncle a look of pure loathing, then took Sansa's hands in his own. "Aerys Targaryen had his tongue ripped out with hot pincers." "He speaks most eloquently with his sword, however," the queen said, "and his devotion to our realm is unquestioned." Then she smiled graciously and said, "Sansa, the good counsellors and I must speak together until the king returns with your father. I fear we shall have to postpone your day with Myrcella. Please, give your sweet sister my apologies. Joffrey, perhaps you would be so kind as to entertain our guest today." "It would be my pleasure, mother," Joffrey said very formally. He took her by the arm and led her away from the wheelhouse, and Sansa's spirits took flight. A whole day with her prince! She gazed at Joffrey worshipfully. He was so gallant, she thought. The way he had rescued her from Sir Ilyn and the Hound, why, it was almost like the songs, like the time Servant of the Mirror Shield saved the Princess Darissa from the giants, or Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight championing Queen Nerys's honor against evil Sir Morgul slanders. The touch of Joffrey's hand on her sleeve made her heart beat faster. "What would you like to do?" "Be with you," Sansa thought, but she said, "Whatever you'd like to do, my prince." Joffrey reflected a moment. "We could go riding." "Oh, I love riding," Sansa said. Joffrey glanced back at Lady, who was following at their heels. "Your wolf is liable to frighten the horses, and my dog seems to frighten you. Let us leave them both behind and set off on our own. What do you say?" Sansa hesitated. "If you like," she said uncertainly. "I suppose I could tie Lady up." She did not quite understand, though. "I didn't know you had a dog." Joffrey laughed. "He's my mother's dog, in truth. She has set him to guard me, and so he does." "You mean the Hound?" she said. She wanted to hit herself for being so slow. Her prince would never love her if she seemed stupid. "Is it safe to leave him behind?" Prince Joffrey looked annoyed that she would even ask. "Have no fear, lady. I'm almost a grown man, and I don't fight with wood like your brothers. All I need is this." He drew his sword and showed it to her. A long sword adroitly shrunken to suit a boy of 12, gleaming blue steel, castle-forged and double-edged, with a leather grip and a lion's head pommel in gold. Sansa exclaimed over it admiringly, and Joffrey looked pleased. "I call it Lion's Tooth," he said. And so they left her dire wolf and his bodyguard behind them, while they ranged east along the north bank of the Trident with no company save Lion's Tooth. It was a glorious day, a magical day. The air was warm and heavy with the scent of flowers, and the woods here had a gentle beauty that Sansa had never seen in the north. Prince Joffrey's mount was a blood-bay courser, swift as the wind, and he rode it with reckless abandon, so fast that Sansa was hard-pressed to keep up on her mare. It was a day for adventures. They explored the caves by the river-bank, and tracked the shadow cat to its lair, and when they grew hungry, Joffrey found a holdfast by its smoke and told them to fetch food and wine for their prince and his lady. They dined on trout fresh from the river, and Sansa drank more wine than she had ever drank before. "My father only lets us have 1 cup, and only at feasts," she confessed to her prince. "My betrothed can drink as much as she wants," Joffrey said, refilling her cup. They went more slowly after they had eaten. Joffrey sang for her as they rode, his voice high and sweet and pure. Sansa was a little dizzy from the wine. "Shouldn't we be starting back?" she asked. "Soon," Joffrey said. "The battleground is right up ahead, where the river bends. That was where my father killed Rhaegar Targaryen, you know. He smashed in his chest, crunch, right through the armor." Joffrey swung an imaginary warhammer to show her how it was done. "Then my uncle Jaime killed old Aerys, and my father was king. What's that sound?" Sansa heard it too, floating through the woods, a kind of wooden clattering, snack, snack, snack. "I don't know," she said. It made her nervous, though. "Joffrey, let's go back." "I want to see what it is." Joffrey turned his horse in the direction of the sounds, and Sansa had no choice but to follow. The noises grew louder and more distinct, the clack of wood on wood, and as they grew closer they heard heavy breathing as well, and now and then a grunt. "Someone's there," Sansa said anxiously. She found herself thinking of Lady, wishing the dire wolf was with her. "You're safe with me." Joffrey drew his lion's tooth from its sheath. The sound of steel on leather made her tremble. "This way," he said, riding through a stand of trees. Beyond, in a clearing overlooking the river, they came upon a boy and a girl playing at knights. Their swords were wooden sticks, broom handles from the look of them, and they were rushing across the grass, swinging at each other lustily. The boy was years older, a head taller and much stronger, and he was pressing the attack. The girl, a scrawny thing in soiled leathers, was dodging and managing to get her stick in the way of most of the boy's blows, but not all. When she tried to lunge at him, he caught her stick with his own, swept